I absolutely want people to talk and tell it like it is so we can talk about what's really going on, what's really happening, and how we really fix it. I also don't want people calling me an N-word to my face just to try and make their point. You know what I'm saying, right? It's not just Black America, because our story tells a larger story of America's inception in general. Our story can't be separated from America. And the true Black American is just an American with all of the same complex wants and needs that their brothers of all colors experience.
Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode of Genuine Chit-Chat. This episode, I am rejoined by Mr. Tony Holt Jr., who is an incredible individual. He really opened up the world for me for Ralph Ellison, and he's waving very enthusiastically there. And he basically opened up my world. People should listen to our prior conversation when we go into this in detail, but it's a very brief thing. He wrote an essay which was about comparing the Black Panther run by Ta-Nehisi Coates to Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. And I was absolutely inspired by that. I re-listened to the Banned Books conversation by Tonya Todd, which had Tony on it talking about Invisible Man. And because I was so inspired by that, I decided to pick up Invisible Man. And it's become my favorite book of all time. I've read a couple of other books that are really close, that are really good, like James by Percival Everett is a phenomenal read. But Invisible Man remains my absolute favourite. I want to reread that at some point. So, Tony and I spoke about Invisible Man a little while ago and had a great time, and we agreed that in 6 months' time, we would talk about Ellison again. But this time we are talking about Ellison's essay collection, Shadow and Act, which is probably his second most famous works. And so it's non-fiction. He tackles a lot of ground here. It was published in 1964, but it has like a lot of things in there from really the late 40s up to 64. And so it's before and after the release of Invisible Man. So we're not going to go through every essay because it would take forever to just even give a brief of all the essays and to talk about all of them. But there's certain themes we're going to talk about. There's certain styles we're going to speak about. There's things that I've learned because this is my first reading of those. And this is Tony's sort of second full read through of Shadow and Act and etc. So we're going to be talking about both of those in detail. And then in the future, we're going to have other conversations about Ellison, about his, other novel that got published after his death, his short story collection, and also Going the Territory. But I don't believe myself or Tony have read Going the Territory. Have you read that, Tony?
Not yet.
No, there we go. So we are going to get into the other Ellison, but this will be Shadow and Act. So, Tony, with Shadow and Act, when we spoke about Invisible Man, you mentioned this book to me, this essay collection. So when did you first read it? How did it impact you and things? Like, what were your first experiences with Shadow and Act? And then what was it like revisiting it?
Wow. I didn't read Shadow and Act, didn't even know about Shadow and Act until I started doing research for the Invisible King's essay that came out in MONOLITH Volume 1. I had read Invisible Man years and years and years ago, 20-some years ago, just after undergrad. And it was a great book, great novel, great story at the time. Put it away, hadn't thought about Ellison for years. When the opportunity to write for the MONOLITH Volume 1 came up, and I made that connection between Invisibility and Black Panther, the Invisible Man book. That's when I started researching both Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ralph Ellison. That's when I came to his essay work and his work, and when it came to the book Shadow and Act. And as I started diving into it, I realized, like you mentioned, the essays going kind of that he worked on before Invisible Man, the essays that he worked on after, the few interviews about himself, his writing style, as well as about, the critical reception of Invisible Man. I realized picking up a copy of Shadow and Act and reading it would help me get deeper into the mind and the understanding of the author and help me put a better spin, put more depth into the essay and the understanding of Invisible Man, and make better connections between the author and the work, make better connections between Black Panther, Invisible Man, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and Ralph Ellison.
Very good. Interesting. So both of us have come at it from quite really a modern perspective. I mean, you're not old and I'm not that old either. We wouldn't be considered old people in most circles, but it's not like we read this in our youth. It wasn't like we read this decades ago. We've only read this post-COVID, really, which is, that's almost probably the big pillar, I think, of what's from almost the 2000s, to really the early 2000s to now. I think that's the big pillars, really, outside of, certain people become president in America and other kind of global events. I think that's the biggest world event that everyone kind of felt similarly across the world to a degree. And so it's quite interesting, like, having that experience. And I think if I'd have read Shadow and Act only 10 years ago, I think it wouldn't have had the same impact. I think, unfortunately, but both fortunately to show how clever Ellison is, but unfortunately to show the state of the world at the moment, so much of this is so much more relevant now to a degree that is really, really worrying. And I say this, any audio only listeners, just for absolute clarity, I am a white British millennial, just to clarify with any of this. So, my perspective, although I do have some interesting things and I've learned a lot from this, I'm not a black person, which is obviously what Ellison was when he was writing this and what he has always been. So, the perspective there is slightly different. And because I'm not based in America, but from speaking with yourself and reading Invisible Man and then being inspired, I've tried to educate myself where I can by, I've read a few Baldwin novels. I've read one of his essays. I've tried watching more documentaries like 13, which is a really interesting one. And I Am Not Your N-Word, which is about James Baldwin again. So I think I've learned a decent-ish degree for someone who this wasn't necessarily in their wheelhouse, definitely not in the education system. But you, good sir, you have, not only being an American, but as you are a person of color, you have, a different perspective to what I have, or at least you have more of a connection to a degree of what Ellison sort of has gone through, or at least some of the things he was speaking about, which is why I'm so excited to have you on, because it's going to really give a great balanced perspective on this. So I want to start by going, you mentioned from the top, off air, sort of his writing styles in this. Now, I note that in the introduction by John F. Callahan, I think it mentions about his changing of style was intentional and things. So when it comes to Ellison's writing and really the themes you felt throughout Shadow and Act, why don't you tell us almost what you discovered, like the key points of not necessarily the essays themselves, but actually the collection as a whole and how Ellison approached this?
It's a great question. And yes, I think, just really briefly, to come back to a point you said, I agree that there's a certain timeless aspect to Ellison's writing, a certain, almost as if his voice is calling out from the past and helping us to put a different lens, a different spin, a different understanding on how we are today, right? I think that's a hallmark of many of our great authors, past, present, and ideally future, that the things they say are timeless to a certain extent. The things that they say are relatable then and now. I think that might actually segue into the question you asked. One of the things that as I revisit Shadow and Act, one of the things that I kind of picked up on, to a larger degree than I did, to a larger degree the second time than when I read it the first time, is Ellison's insistence on telling complex truths about America, Black America, and society at large, right? While Invisible Man was kind of lumped in along with the Black protest novels of the time, Native Son, Richard Wright's novel, whose name escapes me right now.
He's a Black Boy.
Black Boy, thank you. Yeah, he lumped it with protest novels at the time, right? Invisible Man fits in with that narrative. However, what set him apart is his insistence on ensuring that his work and his characters were not flattened, so to speak, right? He alluded to in one of the first interviews in Shadow and Act, that same pain, that same pleasure, where he talks about the importance of writers making sure to tell complex tales without falling into stereotypes, falling into tropes. You can see that in his work in Invisible Man. You can see that in his life as he recounts, growing up in the suburbs in Oklahoma and then moving into the Black community as well. Being a city boy, being raised around book learning, raised in a library, getting a classical music education, while being raised around his Black peers who were working in the cotton fields, learning the spirituals, learning the inside jokes, and the shanty songs of the time, and then learning jazz himself, both in school as well as in the jazz clubs. He lived this complex life that bridged different societies in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, in a way that not all Black Americans were able to. And even he himself said that, he learned about different societies from the people that he met. He learned to want the things that weren't necessarily allowed for or necessarily made for Black Americans at the time, simply because he was exposed to them. Vanity Fair magazine and opera, and how that expanded his mind and made him want to, I think the line is, wear his Sunday clothes every day of the week, right? It's those kind of themes of that complexity of human life, of human nature, that really set Ellison apart from his peers, from his contemporaries, and from both writing and criticism at the time. In many of his interviews, when interviewers tried to boil him down to what the Black perspective is, what the Black American's perspective is, he would often correct them and say, it's not just Black America, because our story tells a larger story of America's inception in general. Our story can't be separated from America. And the true Black American is just an American with all of the same complex wants and needs that their brothers of all colors experience. So that's one of the things that I came back to in my second reading, that as I kind of read up and prepared for this interview, I saw more of that in his writing here, across the essays here, as well as in his work in Invisible Man. That complexity of the characters, that humanity that was basic and understood by everyone, if that makes sense.
No, completely. That's one of the through lines, I think, of Shadow and Act. There's two elements, as you said. One is the musical perspective, which especially Shadow and Act 2, because split in three parts. Shadow and Act 2 is a lot of musical stuff, especially the jazz and the blues. And when I was reading it, it was throwing me off a little bit. I was trying to listen to a lot of the artists that he mentions, actually, and I watched a documentary, Summer of Soul, on Disney Plus, which was about in Harlem during Woodstock. There was actually a soul festival, and so many incredible people played there. And I was like, we were watching it, and it's a great thing. They found this footage that had been in someone's basement for like 40 years, and it's so cool seeing certain artists I've heard of, seeing other artists that I just know by reference. And so when there are certain people like Mahalia Jackson, she was in the documentary, you see her on stage, and he has a whole essay about her. So it's really, really interesting, like that connection whilst, being in the modern world, having access to things like YouTube and etc., being able to look up these things of just what was, watching, Duke Ellington and things like that, Duke Wellington, and like getting to see things like that and different like jazz performers. And there were quite a few that I looked up. So that was interesting with Shadow Act 2. When I first was getting into that, I was unsure where it was going, and then by the end of it, I was like, this makes so much sense, which I do want to delve into the musical perspective. But one of the things you said there specifically, which I found was definitely a through line and really made me realize something that I've been realizing as a podcaster, but this really kind of put the words to it, which is saying this without coming across the wrong way, but essentially the Black perspective, in air quotes, from the perspective of a white person asking about it, can potentially be problematic, because it puts a divide between white people and Black people. And obviously there is a degree of maybe not a divide, but there is a degree of difference there, primarily due to the historical context and then the subsequent what's happened to society and people within the society due to certain elements of history, both all across the West and the world as a whole. But one thing that Ellison really does expertly is really, as you say, he points out time and time again in numerous of these essays, and again some of them are just interviews, where he has to really put his foot down and go, look, I understand you're asking me about the Black perspective, but you cannot even conceive of the Black perspective until you realize that the Black perspective is all perspective. It's all of the American perspective cannot realistically be reviewed or even considered without the Black perspective, in air quotes, being a major part of that, because an intrinsic part of American history is the Black perspective, an intrinsic part of what is the white experience of the days in which he was writing this, again, primarily 40s, 50s and 60s. He's like, well, you can't have the air quotes white perspective in isolation. The only way to review that is to understand that how they've used Black people. Again, when he's writing most of these, the main 4 civil rights acts that got passed in the 60s, most of them hadn't been put through yet. So there was still very huge discrimination and Black people being overtly second-class citizens, not even just a perception of that, but overtly, empirically, they had less rights. So when he's writing these things, he's going, you can't say that there's the American perspective, and then separately there's the Black person perspective, because they are intrinsically connected, and you cannot understand the American perspective as a whole without taking into consideration the experience of Black people, but also the white perspective cannot be seen as totally separate. And that is something that I think I found through podcasting that I found really interesting.
And I love how you say that. I love how you point that out because it is so easy, even myself in America, it is so easy to forget that this country was literally built by black and brown people.
100%.
Right?
Yes.
Right? Like the epidemic of slavery is so ingrained in this country that America wouldn't exist without the black bodies that labor existed in to create this country, right? Ta-Nehisi Coates goes into this a lot in his book Between the World and Me, just talking about black labor, black bodies, black sense and sensibilities, and how deeply ingrained it is in this country. Um, in in one of the essays, he talks about how he goes in a lot about the psychology of both Black America and white America in ways that we were never taught, we never learned in school, right? I don't know what your history was like, but in the US, history is very much in a dichotomy, right? America was built, it was built on the backs of slaves, and slavery was bad, and now we have America and everything is okay, right? And clearly that's not it, because the complexity is again, it's just that it's telling that deep, complex story that one can't exist without the other, and it's the combination of it, that Creole nature that is the U.S. It's that which created such what the nation that I live in, the country that I am born and raised in, and very proud to be an American, because of the communal contributions to the society, right? It'd be a very different world if it was truly as black and white, forgive my pun, if the history was truly as black and white and separate as it's told and as it's taught and as it's described, when the reality is it's more complex, it's more of a mix, and you can't tell one story without telling the other, just like you said. And I'm interested to hear more about your perspective, especially from that podcast lens, right? Talking from the past, coming to the future. When you say that you've seen this through podcasting, you've learned how little space there is, right? How flexible that barrier is through podcasting. Say more about that.
Okay, yeah. So one example I'll give is when I first had Tonya on the podcast. This was back before episode 100. This is in the first 2 years of podcasting. I can revisit these things and notice how I didn't have much tact in certain ways. But to be completely open and honest, and Tonya didn't take offense to this, to my knowledge, I asked her either what her definition of black was or what her identity was interlinked with being a black person in America. It was something along those lines. And, that I don't think she took any offense to that. And I didn't mean any offense to that. It's me genuinely being a curious person. I do have people of color in my life in the UK, but I think in America, skin color is more of a defining factor in certain way people are treated. Whereas over here, it's more so class system and immigration, more so. There's definitely still racism and things over here. But I think back to that conversation and trying to ask certain questions without coming across as a white person trying to say, you're black and different. What's the difference? And it's really hard because as someone who is, a progressive left-leaning person who genuinely does want to know more about the black perspective, especially across, continents and countries, it can be challenging, or at least I didn't realize prior how challenging it can be to try and put it in a way that's respectful. And now I've kind of realized a way to do that more so would be not to target someone and go, here's why you're different to me, tell me about it, and more so let them lead me there. So instead of going in hard with what's the black perspective, just go like, how does your own identity play a role in how you view this? And it's essentially the same question, but what I'm not doing is I'm not labeling the guest or the other person. I'm not inadvertently putting a wall up and putting a divide there. I'm saying we're all different because you have your own identity, I have my own. How do you want to define your own identity, and how much of your own identity do you want to share with me in the audience? And through that, how do you want to share your perspective with me? And that's been something I've realized I've been trying to learn for quite a long time. And reading essays such as this, calling out white people who I think a fair amount of them, not all of them, a fair amount of people who I've seen interview Baldwin or Ellison who are white people, I think their heart is in the right place. But especially because of the era it was in, it was way worse. But I think even today, and there's a quote in one of Ellison's later essays in this actually, where he says, essentially, where is it? It's the American Dilemma. And he says that the right seem to identify the problem and explain it better than the left do, primarily because the left is so scared due to overcaution. And they're both trying to identify a problem. It's just the right are trying to almost blame a problem and things, whereas the left are trying to solve the problem in a way. But he's going, the left are too overcautious. And I think what's happened is because of political correctness, which I'm for, I think what happens is some people are too scared to ask certain questions, while other people are trying to ask questions with no tact and cause offense. And, the way to get someone's honest opinion on things, an honest perspective, is to try and show empathy and to try and go, if I try and ask someone about something that they've gone through that's quite difficult, I will instinctively try and share something of myself that's difficult first to then open the way and go, as much as you want to tell me about your difficult experience in this, grief is quite a common theme in this podcast because obviously I lost my dad and stuff over a decade ago. Through that, I try and do that from the grief perspective. But when it comes from a perspective of where someone is, I think it's about asking them what their identity is and how that plays a role in their perspective and let them take you there. And I think that this is really elements of this have reinforced some of the shortcomings I had as an interviewer and as a person being a white millennial in Britain, compared to sort of nowadays and how I'm trying to go forward, still having interesting conversations, but without putting a divide up, I think.
That's great. Firstly, thank you. That's brilliant. I appreciate you sharing that and that vulnerability, because that growth and change you just kind of walked us through. Again, it very much resonates with the growth and change that we are starting to see and definitely need to see more in the culture today, right? That the concept you said of the left being too cautious and the right being too callous, if you will, we see that without getting too deep into politics. You can see that playing out in America today, right? There, so many political pundits have said this and that is the reason why, potentially Democrats lost the election, Republicans may have won it, right? And on both sides of the aisle, I can see some agreements, right? I absolutely want people to talk and tell it like it is so we can talk about what's really going on, what's really happening, and how we really fix it. I also don't want people calling me an N-word to my face just to try and make their point. You know what I'm saying, right? There has to be like you said, there has to be a certain tact with how we approach these difficult conversations, but it doesn't mean we can shy away from that difficult conversation. It's something that you learned, and I think everyone has to learn through experience. Something that Ellison talks about and that you see him do through his experiences and through the interviews that are shared in Shadow and Act, right? Very much like you said, I want to bring up one essay really quick, The World in the Jug, where he sits down with one of his friends and says, a year ago, a friend argued with me for hours that I could not possibly write a novel because of my experience as a Negro had been too excruciating to allow me to achieve that psychological and emotional distance necessary to artistic creation, right? You can't, how could you, being a Black man in America and going through that physical, mental, psychological torture, how could you possibly separate yourself enough to have that objectivity to create an artistic work, which we can argue about whether or not you need it, but that's a different podcast maybe. On the opposite page, he says he seems to never have considered that an American Negro life is for the Negro who must live it not only a burden, but also a discipline, just as any human life which has endured so long is a discipline teaching its own insights into the human condition, its own strategies of survival. Not only is it important that every human, Black American, white American, every American of every stripe, acknowledge, understand, and go through that difficult conversation, that mental pain, that physical pain. But it's important that we all recognize, one, that no matter what your pain is, your pain matters. Mm-hmm. And two, it is necessary for you to learn, understand, and teach someone else what it's like to be you. Without that pain, we can't have an understanding of what it's like to be us. And we can't hope to bridge that divide to help someone else understand what it's like to be us, right? You need to have that connection to your pain, whatever that pain may be. You can still live a charmed life and still be in pain. You can be in the gutter and still have joy and happiness in your life. But unless you can acknowledge and understand it, you can't talk to someone else about it and come together.
Agreed. And I think linking with that is still with sort of, because The World in the Jug, I think, is arguably his most famous essay from this collection. I only found that out like moments before recording. I was looking up something just to see, is Indivisible Man in Shadow and Act? So I managed to find a place that had an ebook and the contents and stuff. And then there's a specific bit about The World in the Jug. But in that, one thing which I found to be quite interesting with it is he on page I've got the collected essays, so the page numbers in which I have are going to be different for yours, but around a few pages in, 20 pages in or so, he questions the role as a race man and how to be a good N-word. And so I think he also mentions about, in the following page, he says, he questions why he and James Baldwin must be compared to the fellow black author Richard Wright, when white or Jewish authors aren't compared in the same way to other white and Jewish authors, i.e. their race being a major factor. And this is something that I know that when I first started this podcast and I was talking to people of color, especially in America, one of the big frustrations, especially when it comes to the arts and filmmaking and things, is if a black woman director makes a film and it isn't great, she in some ways becomes the kind of the poster child for reasons why white men shouldn't let women or black people make art. And it's one of those things that I know is really frustrating, where I think this is where, when it comes to white privilege, I think there's a lot of things which people do talk about and are overt things about white privilege. You know, if I don't get a job, I'm not worried it's because of my race. That isn't something that comes into my mind. But I think there's a lot of other areas of white privilege which people don't really talk about, mainly because white people just don't understand it. And I imagine a lot of people of color are fully aware of it, but they don't necessarily always want to talk to white people about it, because white people can be quite defensive about these things. But one thing that I think is quite a prominent part is white people are never scared in public about being the representation of a minority. And I think, excluding maybe Jewish people to a degree, but I think that's less so. There is anti-Semitism out there, definitely, but I think that's less so. But ignoring that group, because I haven't looked into the struggle of that group at all, and I'm not a Jewish individual, but generally just white people, if I go out and do something bad in the news, I'm not worried that other white people are going to be criticized for me doing that. But I know empirically, I've seen it in the news, even in modern day, in 2025, I've seen it, where you have someone who is anyone other than a straight white male, who's generally middle class or upper class, anyone outside of that, if they do anything wrong, they can then be reprimanded and held accountable, and then other people in that demographic are then also held accountable. And I know that Baldwin, especially because I've listened to a lot of interviews with Baldwin as well, who's really, really interesting, and him and Ellison both get very frustrated with this, of going, essentially, why is it that I'm now the poster child for black men in America? Why am I the one that I can't step out of line? And if I say something, you think this is the opinion of all black people? And I know, you know, I do enjoy South Park, but I know there's I'm a very big fan of South Park for the most part, but there's one episode where Randy says the N-word on like a Price is Right kind of thing. And essentially the way he has to apologize for it is by kissing Jesse Jackson's ass. And the whole joke of it, the whole joke of it is that there's one black person that is like the elder, the one black person who represents all of the like the feelings of the whole community, when there isn't one whole community of any demographic of people. There's not one community. There's subsections in all of it, be it a tiny community or a large one. There's no way. And I think Ellison and Baldwin, and even in that South Park episode, Token, he says, just because this one famous black person says this, that is not representative of everyone. Terry Crews has come out years ago and said, oh, I haven't experienced racism in Hollywood. And a lot of like white liberals were like, yeah, good. See, we're making progress. It's like, just because one black person hasn't necessarily experienced racism or known he has, that doesn't mean you've cured racism. And I think that's one big thing that I'm finding a lot more about reading these is, as we go from the 40s and the 50s into the 60s, when the Civil Rights Act comes, as an English person, that you just asked about history. In British history, we learned nothing about black suffrage at all. I didn't
Okay.
know. I barely knew we owned parts of Africa. I barely knew anything about the genocidal parts of the Commonwealth, of going over to certain countries and just wiping people out until they fell in line. That's really why Gandhi opposed to us. We learnt about Gandhi. We didn't learn why he was such a powerful speaker. We're like, yeah, he fought the bad guys. Who are the bad guys? Let's not talk about that. It's like we never learnt that the line between Pakistan and India, the partition, was caused by England in the last century. We did that.
Yeah.
I never knew about that. I found that out from Miss Marvel. And so learning about...
Shout out to Miss Marvel.
Yeah, it's great. The villains are a smidge weak, but outside of that, it's an amazing show. I loved Miss Marvel. Really, I shout that from the rooftops. I love that show. But because of and Megan said it before, there's such a shortcoming in the history system where the transatlantic slave trade, Megan had to teach a cover lesson for that in school, and she didn't know anything about it. She was like, there are kids who know more about it, and she was having to ask questions and look up stuff, and she's like, I don't know about it. And because of reading this and other stuff, and me learning about the difference in sort of the era of, from the Emancipation Proclamation and then the Civil Rights, the Civil War, and then the 13th Amendment formally, from there to arguably the biggest Civil Rights Act in 1965 is 103 or 100 years or so. And you're like, so in that, the Reconstruction era is specifically this weird limbo where black Americans were no longer slaves, but they weren't fully considered citizens. And there's 100 years of this. 100 years ago, we were still in this. In World War I and II, we were still in this. I say we, the country, the nation of America. And I think that's one of the shocking things as I've delved into this and learnt more about it and things, is that only 60 years ago, and because I think the last Civil Rights Act, to a degree of that era, was, I think, 67 or 69. So you go, literally 60 odd years ago from now, black individuals' rights were immediately lesser than their white equivalent. And that was 60 years ago. There are people who are alive remember that. And in Baldwin's writings and essays, in Ellison and Baldwin's writings, they have characters that go, oh yeah, my granddad was a slave. And it's so recent. And I think a lot of people in America and across the world, especially white people, want to try and push a lot more distance and go, that happened ages ago. Why are you still worrying about that? Why are you still upset about that? It's like, it wasn't that long ago. So I know I've just thrown a lot about, being trying to be a representative of one's own race and the lack of historical education, but take your pick.
I mean, coming back to black people as a monolith, absolutely. It's the common trope in Black America. You have to be twice as good for half the rewards, right? It's the idea that, like you mentioned, that Ellison gets at, where there is a certain psychology within the Black community where while we are so hard on our own, especially parents and children, right? Why parents make sure to have the talk with their Black children, because at times Black Americans are seen as a monolith, right? We are either all good or all bad, oftentimes all bad, right? The 1990s Bill Clinton era, Hillary Clinton coining the term super predator and putting that shadow on the Black community. The Reagan era welfare queen, the image of the Black woman living off the government, right? And being able to come up with those effigies, with those ideas, and being able to paint a whole people with that same brush is something. I'm definitely not going to say it's unique to the Black American experience, but it is something that, let's say, America is well practiced at, and we have seen it play out, like you mentioned, especially in those 100 years during the Reconstruction era, from then till now. In fact, that comes back to the podcast I just recently did, the Banned Movies podcast with Tanya Todd, on Birth of a Nation, and how that movie, that is still regarded as a cinema, as kind of it's still gone in history as one of the cinematographic great movies of America, which they had some amazing new cinematographic technologies and techniques that they used to create a strong racist propaganda movie that is still used to this day, to paint an entire people with a broad brush in a negative light, right? Yeah, black people are not a monolith, and there is not one person ideal that describes us all. And I agree, a lot of Ellison's time is spent trying to break down that stereotype. A lot of his ethos around telling complex stories is all about breaking down that stereotype and helping his audience, helping the larger world realize that there's more complexity and more flavor. The same complexity and flavor that makes up all of the world is the same thing you find within Black America, right? Um, I think that's a really astute point. And coming back to kind of the history of kind of what we learned in school, recognize that I didn't learn all these things either, man. Like the edu the way I mean, history is written by the winners, right?
Yeah.
That alone is a very clear and specific lens through which everything is written and everything is taught. And especially when you're young, how do you tell a complex story to someone, right? We're raised to have very simple and straightforward stories. Here's the hero, here's the villain. Heroes always win, villains always lose. But as we grow and as we change and as we get deeper into more complex stories, and I honestly I will thank the transitions in pop culture. I think a lot of comic book culture and a lot of comic book stories have helped us to tell better stories about our villains, the complexity of that villain, especially when it comes to your stereotypical black villain, right? And how on the surface, the easy Sunday morning comic book, they are told to be shown to be just a straight up black villain, dark hat, evil character. But as you dig deeper into their story, there is a reason, there is a trauma, there is a past, there is a goal that at one time may have been laudable and may have been corrupted by themselves, their ambition, or by society at large, right? Even the Black Panther himself, who starts as a hero, has always been cast as a hero, emerged as this black figure coming after the Fantastic Four, right? He, in his most recent comic book run, he is shunned by his own people and pushed out of Wakanda, no longer the king to a nation, and now a terrorist on the run, being hunted by one and all. It's those complexities that, number one, are often lost to history, and number two, don't make for a good story for a country, a nation trying to boil down the best bits of it to tell the next generation, to maintain its idea of American exceptionalism. So it's not just you; it's all of us that have that deficiency in knowledge. That are, in my opinion, it's all of us that are missing that complexity of the stories and of the history. And as I dug into Shadow and Act, as I did my research for Black Panther, I started learning more and reading more about that, and learning more of the things that I didn't know about Reconstruction era, about the Civil Rights era. Even about my own hometown of Detroit, Michigan, and how integral it was to things like the labor movement during the 60s and 70s. There's a great book that I read a couple of years ago called Detroit, I Do Mind Dying. And while I had always known that the labor movement was strong in Detroit, the union organization was strong in Detroit, until I read that book, it wasn't clear to me how integral that labor movement was to the civil rights movement, both in Detroit and around the country, if not, the empowerment of blacks around the world.
Yeah, it's one of those that I found. It's one of those where I think Britain is a weird country in a lot of ways from our perspective on race, because compared to America, which is not, this is the problem here. When we compare our history to America, we go, yeah, but America did all that bad stuff. We didn't do half that stuff. And it's like, well, actually, we kind of started it all. The transatlantic slave trade was started by Britain. America, the whole of the going over to America, Chris Columbus and that kind of era was from Europeans, including Britons, people going over there thinking they're better than the native people, whether primarily intentionally or even inadvertently exterminating the vast majority of them. The only way I say inadvertently is the illness that they took over did wipe out a substantial amount, but there were still horrendous atrocities that were overtly killing them as well. So it's, but like all these things, and Britain trying to be like, yeah, we were the first nation to really abolish slavery. And it's like, well, to a degree, but we were also the one who just kind of accepted it for many years. And actually, it wasn't really until World War II until we actually kind of started pushing back on America and going, you guys really need to treat your people of color a bit better. And that was only really because over here, there was a couple of circumstances where, and I didn't know this, in World War II, the black people and white people were separate. They were separated in garrisons and in squads and things. So a lot of the time what would happen is the black squadrons would go first, they would be gunned down by people, and then the white ones would go for and that was quite a common thing. In the UK, to our faults, we didn't do that. It was, if you're in the army, it doesn't matter on what race you are in the army. You're all equivalent in a sense. So what kept happening is, because we were one of the bases for Americans, coming to the UK and then going to Europe to fight in World War II, what would happen is our nation would be fine with people of colour for the most part. There are exceptions in areas, but generally it'd be like, oh, if you're in army gear and you're a person of colour, you are a soldier first, a black American second, And what happened is when Americans would go into certain pubs, there's what I think is the Battle of Bridgewater or something like that. Essentially, there was an event that occurred where white Britons and white Americans clashed because of black American soldiers trying to come in, and the black soldiers that were the British ones were fine with it, obviously. So were the white British as well, but the white Americans weren't. And it caused, there was like a shootout and everything. There was quite a lot of what happened there. And essentially from that event and one other one, someone was killed, but none of the white people end up getting punished in any way, but all the black people did. And what happened was England as a nation said, right, if you come over here and you come to our country, you have to treat your people as we would here. There's no more of this. You come over here and your black soldiers are second-rate citizens. So there are little moments in history where we've helped a bit, but I think that Britain, what happens, especially because of the last century, is we go, we're the good guys because we're the ones that beat the Nazis. And it's like, but prior to the 1900s, we were the bad guys. Like, it was really, we were the bad guys until the only people worse than white colonizers are probably Nazis. You know what I mean? Like, on a macro level. I'm not talking on an individual level, but you got to think, like, who's worse than that? It's probably, Nazis are probably the only ones. So it's like, it took for the worst of us to get slightly worse than the rest of us for us to go, no, we're the good guys now. And that's something that I'm constantly trying to reevaluate as a British person, which is trying, because I'm not patriotic. I'm grateful that I was born a white millennial with parents who had enough money and a man. A lot of the elements that make life complicated, I don't have to deal with. So I'm grateful in that regard of the privilege, but I'm also, it's bittersweet because it's frustrating that so much history and so much of what makes a person, I'm not only not told, but I'm actually told the inverse. And I think a lot of, I imagine, white liberals across America and England, they probably have this same struggle of, I want to know more and it's painful for me to learn more, and then trying to not be angry about it in the wrong way and trying to kind of process these feelings. And that again falls to white privilege because that is the literal reality every day of a person of colour. Every day. So it's, again, me coming in this way of going like, oh, I'm feeling a bit bad because I didn't learn this stuff. And it's like, yeah, but that's still even do you know what I mean? It's like a lens of privilege, which is also, it's a feedback loop. Do you know what I mean? Of reevaluation.
Yeah. But I will say, I think it's something that you just said interesting because I think you also described the struggle in Black America as well, right? I want to learn more, but it's hard because I don't have access to the information, and the way my story is told, it makes me feel bad, right? Mm. It's a different feeling, but it's a similar outcome. It's that feedback loop of how do I understand, process, and deal with the psychological pain of the history of our country, the people who look like me and the people who don't, right? It's like Ellison would say, it's that same feeling that comprises both of our histories and connects us more than it separates us. That feeling you just described, I would tell you that I have the same feeling as I learn more about Reconstruction, about the Civil Rights era, about my history that I wasn't taught in school. It is both liberating for me to learn and grow and understand with. It is also hard for me to approach and dive into and really struggle with. And at times, it is difficult for me to struggle to understand how to process those feelings, how to be righteously indignant, and at the same time understanding that it's not clear to me that it could have gone any other way, right? How can you build a nation without having that rah good story to make sure that you do have patriotic, proud citizens? How do you tell the story of your people without it being a hero's journey? Because everything else becomes a sad story, right? Does that, if that makes sense at all? It's about making sense of that struggle. And I think a lot of Ellison, again, we keep coming back to Ellison's work and trying to break down those barriers and break down that ideal that it's not two different stories, but it's one story. And part of that story is about telling the story of that struggle and realizing that maybe it's about realizing that there are no heroes. There are only people. And that the only way forward is to acknowledge all of our pain, all of our suffering, and recognize that we all can play a part in growing together as a people into the world that we want. That might be that may have sounded more profound than I actually am. Or maybe I just didn't make any sense there.
It did. No, it made complete sense. And I think you've touched upon something there, which I think what happens, especially in the modern day, in 2025, when you talk to people about race, you get a lot of people in different camps, whether they're a person of color or whether they're a white person. You get into various groups of people, and this is across all the races and demographics, which is some people go, but it's fine, it's solved. And there's people of color who feel like this and trying to ignore the fact that racism still exists and there's still this kind of stuff. And there's a lot of white people who also try and do it, but then there's also a lot of them which try and go, yeah, but how do we solve it? And then there's other ones who go, yeah, it's still prominent overtly. And you get this clashing because it's such an individual thing. And one of the things that Ellison says, I think it might be in The World in the Jug, but I think he illustrates it really well in Shadow and Act 3 in the collection, specifically in The Way It Is and Harlem Is Nowhere. When he talks to that woman in 1942 in The Way It Is, that is one of the best essays and one of the most powerful ones, I think, in the collection, because apart from one little paragraph at the end, he doesn't really give you his perspective. All he does is he transcribes a conversation he had with a local black woman in Harlem, and the whole struggle of like, her son is in the army now because he couldn't get a job in this thing, and she has a friend or it's her sister or something whose son was killed in the Navy, all because he tried to get a job at this electronics place when he was an absolute master at building electronics and putting things back together and etc. He was a master at it. That was his passion. He went to these places, they wouldn't hire him because he's a person of color, and then he went off to the Navy because there's nothing else to do, and he gets killed there. And it's like, that's a story that's so powerful. You could make a movie of just that story and it would win Oscars. Mm-hmm. You'd have loads of people falling over it and stuff. But that is the everyday reality of, I mean, again, it was 1942, but there are still examples of these things happening. And I think the way that one can try and change the minds, I think, of primarily the people who are resistant to acknowledging that racism still exists and there's still baggage on both sides. There's a lot of stuff that I can't remember if Ellison or Baldwin has said it in things outside of this, which is kind of like white guilt. A lot of it comes from the fact that the atrocities that were caused by our ancestors, or whatever, and us not processing it or talking about it. And then it comes out in ways where sometimes it comes out in ways that are actually negative towards people of color. And other times it comes in ways which are trying so hard to not be negative. It loops around and becomes negative, as we spoke about earlier on in this conversation. And it's so
like
hard.
The Birth of a Nation versus affirmative action, and now now the abolishment of DEI. Absolutely.
Exactly. That's it. And it's just like people, and there's no, unfortunately, there's no right answer, which is the thing, again, which Ellison and Baldwin say, because they go, how would you solve this? And they're like, there is no answer. There's not like so obviously pre-civil rights era, it was give us the rights and then we can start. Then we can kind of start to repair. But sort of, that's why I'll be interested when we eventually get to going the territory, because there is an essay I saw in there which I haven't read, it's called something like, what America would be like if black people never existed. And I wonder if it inspired Ta-Nehisi Coates in some way, because I've heard of that book you mentioned as well. Someone recommended that to me in a bookshop when I bought a Baldwin novel. But the thing is like, thank you so much for listening, friends. That is the end of part 1. Part 2 will be out in a couple of weeks' time on this channel, but if you can't wait that long, you can check out the audio-only version, which is on every podcast feed of Genuine Chit-Chat. A link to that is in the description. But make sure you check out all the details in the description, including Tony's Comics Lit essay, as well as all the other stuff he's got going on, including being involved with the Pop Gorillas 2.0. So please make sure you subscribe, like all that jazz, and you will not miss part 2 of this episode. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll speak to you soon.